Thank you. And I would like to welcome everybody to today's IEO seminar. My name is Nicoletta Batini. I'm going to chair this event for the Independent Evaluation Office webinar series. So the events today, the topic of the event today is the market for rare metals and implications for phasing out fossil fuels. Where do we stand? Let me start by reminding our audience that rare metals, rare earth metals, sometimes mentioned, are essential to clean energy, including electric vehicles, wind turbines, solar panels, and also computer electronics like smartphones, tablets, and everyday connected objects, as well as national defense, like things like fighter jets. But consumers and as economists often know little about how these metals are mined and traded, or the environmental, economic, and geopolitical challenges and opportunities that these markets pose to the green transition. And so this webinar looks behind the scenes and reviews the status of rare metals markets and implications for the green energy transition, and also our prices, global inflation that goes with commodity price inflation. I've invited for this particular topic 2 experts in the area. The first speaker will be Guillaume Pitron. Guillaume is a French journalist. He's written for Le Monde Diplomatique, National Geographic, and many others. And he's also a documentary maker for France's leading television channels. In 2018, Guillaume published his first book with the title, The Rare Metals War, The Dark Side of the Energy Transition and Digitalization. And his work focuses on commodities and the economic, political, and environmental issues associated with the use of commodities, in particular in this book of rare earth metals. He's author 100 reports and more, investigation documentaries across more than 40 countries. He sent me some links to some of these videos and documentaries, which is unbelievably interesting. And he has been awarded about 20 French and international journalism awards, including Le Monde's Israel Zevich Prize for Best Investigative Report of the Year. Guillaume holds a postgraduate law degree from the University of Paris and a master's in international law from the University of Georgetown in Washington, D.C. Our second speaker is Simon Michaux, who's an associate professor of geometallurgy at the Geological Survey of Finland, GTK, in the Circular Economy Solutions Unit. He holds a degree in physics and geology and a PhD in mining engineering from the GKMRC University of Queensland. Simon focuses on the development and transformation of the circular economy into a more practical system for the industrial ecosystem to navigate the twin challenges of the scarcity of technology minerals and the transitioning away from fossil fuels. So with this necessary chapeau in a field which is not properly strictly of the domain of economics as we think, I would like to give the mic to Guillaume Pitron, who's going to tell us about why rare metals are important, what is the role in the transition, and what's going on in these markets. And after that, Simon will give us some more details on, the current outstanding stock of these metals and, the projections that we can expect out of the situation. So Guillaume, the floor is yours. You have 25 minutes to present. Thank you, and please share your presentation.
Thank you, Nicoletta Batini, for inviting me. Thank you very much. I'm starting with the first slide of my presentation. I'm very honored to be speaking to you today. You've said it. I've been publishing a couple of years ago this book, The Rare Metals War. Basically, the book is about all these resources whose name you see on the left of the screen, which are base metals and also so-called rare metals, which are absolutely necessary for the clean energy transition. And it's not a story which is being sufficiently told, but there is no energy transition without metals and minerals. Coal was necessary for the first energy transition, oil was necessary for the second energy transition, starting in the 20th century. And now we are undergoing the third energy transition towards clean technologies. And few people still understand that for making this transition possible, we'll need base metals such as copper, for example. Copper is very important for the energy transition. You need as much as up to 4 times more copper to manufacture an electric car comparing to a conventional car. But you also need iron and steel for different clean technologies, batteries or wind turbines. And you also need vast amounts of so-called rare metals, which are not really rare actually, but they are very diluted in the Earth's crust, and this is why we call them rare. They are much more rare than base metals. And these metals are cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, which is a family of 15 metals, lithium, which could be considered as rare, and also other of the metal that was named you see on the screen. You need these metals for EV batteries, for example, cobalt, graphite, which is a mineral extracted in China, but also rare earths for 90% of electric car motors. You need rare earths for offshore wind turbines. We need a critical metal, which is not very rare, but critical. I get back to what critical means, such as silicium metal, in order to manufacture power plants, solar panels. And as you see, the International Energy Agency tells us that in the next 20 years, the need for this resource will be multiplied by whether it's 42 for lithium or 20-fold for graphite, cobalt, and nickel, but also 7-fold for rare earths. This is the multiplication of the needs for actually respecting a 2-degree scenario according to the international energy transition. And the question is, where do we get these metals from? The Paris Agreement, COP21, it's a 29-page agreement, and at no point the word mining, metals, mineral resources is being written, expressed in this COP21 Paris Agreement. So the question as a journalist that I've been trying to investigate is, where will we get these metals from? And will there be a cost for the environment? And where will be the next Saudi Arabias of these resources, which could hold an added value on the market of these metals? And is there a geopolitics of these resources? And if we tell maybe the counter story of the energy transition, I just would like to start by showing you that this, as I just confirmed with this graphite with this graph by the International Energy Agency, that, as you can see, electric cars need much more metals than conventional cars. An offshore wind turbine needs much more metals than a coal power plant. So this is just to confirm the need for such resources in the future. And as a journalist, I've been traveling on the field for many years. I've been going a couple of times to China, 3 times in China, among other countries for the last 10 years, in order to see what the extraction of some of these resources looks like. And I'd like to take you to Heilongjiang, which is a province that I've been visiting north of China a couple of years ago, in a documentary for Amazon Prime and Arte Television in France. And I just would like to show you what a graphite mine looks like seen from a drone. And it doesn't look like it's not different from any other mine in the world, but I just would like to remind you that anything that is called green and clean and sustainable and responsible stems from a scar in the ground. And this is what you can see when we talk about a graphite mine in China. And some pictures that I could take, and these are screen captures from TV footage, but you can see just rejection, some waste from the mine directly in nature without any administrative or legal control. And so that tells you something about the pollution generated by the mining and refining activities of graphite. Men working with their face completely covered with scarves in order not to breathe the air, which is filled with particles which are very bad for the health. They say are you know, are they express how dangerous for the health breathing these particles can be. And you can see the graphite when you plunge your hand you know, into a bag of graphite powder, what it can look like. So you know, this is what I could witness. And you see here just, you know, the bags of 25 kg graphite bags ready to be exported, either I mean sent to the rest of China or exported abroad in order to be, among other usages, featured into electric car batteries. Graphite is an essential component of batteries for electric cars. The same period, I was in the city of Baotou, northwest of Beijing, in the province of Inner Mongolia. And Baotou is very well known because it's a place where 75% of the world rare earths, let's say 60%, are being extracted today. And what we see over there is refining areas, the refining manufactories of rare earths. And these refining manufactories belong to the Baogang, Chinese Baogang group. These manufactories need considerable amounts of water in order to separate the rock from the metal, to purify the metal, and also lots of chemical products are being used in the process. And the water, which is filled with chemicals and other waste, is just being rejected directly into what we call the Weiquan Dam, which is an impressive area, artificial lake, where the water on the back of the screen, as you can see, is just directly rejected and without any environmental control. And people who speak here are either locals, but also officials speak actually, and they both say the same. Cancers, irresponsible companies, regulations do exist, but in factual terms, they're not really being applied by companies. And one specialist of the rare earth industry in China, was name is Vivian Wu, once told me China has sacrificed its environment to feed the rest of the world with rare earths. So as you can see, there is a discrepancy between what we say when we talk about green technologies and the reality of these technologies, of the impact on the environment of these technologies when we look at the way the metals they feature are being produced. And somehow we must say it, that clean technology is a dirty business. It's not a very comfortable way of saying it, but I have to be honest with you. You know, clean is never clean. There's always someone who has to pay the price for it. And the Chinese are paying a huge environmental price for it. We don't pay the price in Europe, and we pay a very small amount of this price in the United States and other Western countries because we don't have the mining activities anymore. We used to in the past. Look at the blue line, the blue graph. Europe used to amount for more than 60% of the world mining production back in the 19th century. But today, Europe stands for 3% of the mining activities, the mining production, whereas we, the Europeans, account for 22, 23% of the mining consumption. And this, we can see and witness this same evolution with the United States, for example. And if I may say in this way, the mining activities have been so polluting, including the rare earth mining activity in the United States back in the 1980s, and also mining activities in Australia in the rare earth business, that actually someone is saying something. That actually we just prefer to close the mine and to let other countries with poor environmental and social standards do the dirty job. And in a way, the pollution of these mines, but also the pollution of the green technologies has been outsourced. We've outsourced the pollution, and we are hardly aware of the dirty side of clean technologies because these mines are thousands of kilometers away from us. And this is how we come up to this situation of countries which have accepted, instead of the European countries, Western countries, including the United States, which have accepted to, relocate this mining production on their territory. Some countries have huge resources of lots of metals necessary for clean technologies, and they've been ready back to the 80s, 1980s, to actually bear the price of these mining activities, but in return of economic growth. And the European Union, every 3 years, and this map dates back to 2020, the European Union has been producing for the last years this map which is being updated regularly, and which says which countries are producing some of the very important metals for clean technologies. And we see South Africa, we see a bit of Chile with Brazil. Actually, Australia is the first producer of lithium today before Chile, but we see also a little bit of the United States for beryllium, which is being used for defense industries and also electronic industries. Russia with palladium, necessary for catalysis, and China. And China has become the leader, a world leader in the production of many of the metals that are necessary for clean technologies. And we are in a situation where these metals are becoming critical. And critical means, according to the United States, but to European Commission, that they are not necessarily rare, but because of the concentration of the production within the end of a couple of countries, there might be some risks of shortages in the future. And the list of critical minerals of the United States has been recently updated and features 50 minerals and metals, as you can see this list, which are being considered as critical because the United States either don't produce them at all or don't produce sufficient amounts, volumes of them, and they are at risks of supply risk. And as you understand, China is actually, mining this most of these commodities for its own needs. Because what does China do? China doesn't want to just produce these metals for the rest of the world. China wants to go down the value chain. And what we've seen for the last 20 years, 25 years, is China actually holding back the resource, these metals for a cleaner world, for its own needs. And as Sheng Zhangheng, one of the important executives of the China Rare Earth Industry Association, told me, China wants to make the most of its of the minerals and metals added value for the sake of its own industries. So China doesn't want to, sell the metals, the minerals. It wants to sell the metals. China wants to sell the magnets, which are necessary for offshore wind turbines and cars. China wants to sell the finished product, including EV batteries and solar panels and wind turbines. And there are many reasons why China today has become a leader in the energy transition, with 30% of the world installed capacity of wind turbines and 60% of the world production of solar panels. I might even say 80%, and 87% of the world production of magnets, which are very strategic for EV mobility. China has become so successful because it's been, among other reasons, able to secure the resource to actually turn this resource into a finished product that it's able to sell. And the question here is, where does the West stand? Are we sufficiently strong to actually and willing to hold back on our side the downstream value chain of these technologies in order to get the green jobs in the West and not let these green jobs leave to China? I would like to insist upon some metals that China doesn't have, but China is clever enough to secure the resources of these metals outside of its borders. And this figure, which was published by the International Energy Agency, tells us about lithium, nickel, cobalt, and graphite down the value chain. As you see, graphite China produces most of the graphite on Earth. But as you see also, lithium is not a resource that China produces in important quantities at the world scale. China accounts for 14% of the world production of lithium. China produces very few volumes and amounts of nickel, and China doesn't produce doesn't produce any cobalt. But lithium, nickel, and cobalt are three strategic commodities for electric batteries. And what China has been doing for the last years is going outside of its borders, developing a mineral diplomacy towards many producing countries in order to secure the resource. Let me take the example of lithium. China has two companies, Tianqi Lithium and Ganfeng Lithium, and these two companies have been successful enough for the last years to secure the resources either from Chilean and Australian mining companies for lithium, and then the lithium is being exported back to China, where it's being refined. And if you look at the graph, the second graph in the material processing, you see that China doesn't produce much of the lithium, but has been able to import the lithium back on its territory and to refine it on its own. And today, China accounts for 55% of the world production refining of lithium. And if you look at cobalt, it's a very interesting example. Cobalt is today produced in the Democratic Republic of Congo, most of it. 60% of the world production of cobalt is coming from the region of Katanga, south of Congo. And China has been clever enough for the last decades to secure the resource by owning its own mine, buying production from Glencore, among other companies, and also securing part of the black market of cobalt. And it's conventional wisdom that 80% of the world of the production of cobalt coming specifically from DRC is actually exported to China. And that explains why in the material processing part, China once again accounts for 65% of the world processing of cobalt. And then China moves down the value chain, is able to produce most of the cell components and battery cells of electric vehicles. And at the very end, well, actually, China is able to produce more than half of the electric vehicles on Earth today. So this figure, very interestingly enough, tells us how China, cleverly enough, has been able to build a strategy of either producing these metals on its own territory, or deploying a mineral diplomacy around the world, notably towards African countries, Australia, South America, in order to be able to secure the entire value chain from the mine to the lab, from the mine to the EV production line, to the battery production line. And this is where the question is, how do we in the West react to that? Countries today in the West are starting to react, but with such a delay. I would say that the United States are leading this reaction comparing to the European Union and comparing to Japan. And there are, I would say, six actions that are being taken either by the United States, by Japan, or by the European Union to actually counter this Chinese dominance. The first one is a review of vulnerabilities in critical material supply chain. As you have seen, the European Union has been updating a list of critical minerals. Companies are starting to do the same. Countries are doing the same. The United States are doing the same. In my view, it has started with the Donald Trump administration reviewing these vulnerabilities, especially for the defense sector, because the defense industry, and it's been said by Nicoletta Batini, is very much dependent upon rare earths for F-35 fighter jets and also for precision-guided missiles. And recently, the Biden administration, in February 2021, has launched a new review of these vulnerabilities. So before you act, you need to understand where you stand. And then mining diplomacy is starting to take shape. Whether it's mining diplomacy is developed by the United States, but also by European countries and also Japan. Japan has been very good, for example, at securing rare earths from Lynas, an Australian company which produces rare earths on the Australian soil, and Japan has been spending and investing in such a company in order to make sure that it could get alternative sources of rare earths and not depending upon China. European Union also is deploying such a diplomacy towards Latin American countries and Greenland. Recently, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has spoken, actually it was last week, saying lithium rare earths are set to become the next oil and the next gas. And she added that we need in the West, in Europe, to look at develop new commercial partnerships with Australia, with Chile, with Mexico. These countries have resources of rare earths and lithium, and that's not going to be easy to get there. Just for a reason, it's because we are thirsty for these metals and hungry for these metals. But on the other hand, these countries, producing countries such as Mexico and Chile, are deploying what we call resource nationalism. They want to keep the resource for their own needs. They want to go down the value chain like the Chinese did. And resource nationalism is a factor that needs to be taken into consideration to understand that mining diplomacy may not be such an easy stuff, an easy action in the next years. But still, we have to go in this direction. Extractive removal is a very important question. It's true in the United States, for example, where the mine of Mountain Pass, which produces rare earths, has been reopened recently and produces the rock. Produces the oxide, but the United States don't have the refining part, so they still need to send the oxide to be refined back to China. And this is a big question to revive the extractive sector in our countries, because the consumer don't want to accept the idea that to drive green, we'll need to dig deeper. And this is such a contradiction that it's not really to be accepted by opinions. And when it's about opening a lithium mine in Nevada or in California or in the west of France, in Brittany, well, many strong local opposition is being felt against these potential mining activities. And so we see here the tensions that are real when it's about, trying to find a middle way. Because of our contradictions, we as consumers, we want to have the world clean, but we don't want to go through the dark side, the polluting part of green technologies. Investing in gigafactories and magnet facilities is getting strong. The United States will open, I think, 13 or 15 gigafactories from now until 2025. And also in Europe, 28 gigafactories, which will open in the next 8 years. So we want to go down the value chain. The question is, where do we get the materials from? Strategic stockpiling is important. Japan is strong at that, and the Biden administration is accelerating in that trend. And the last point, and I will leave that to Simon Michaux, is recycling and circular economy. I don't know how long my talk has been. I hope I haven't been too long. I just want to tell you, I just want to end by saying that we have gained over the last years, over the last decades, we in the West, buying power, but we've lost buying knowledge. And it's hard for the average consumer, even myself, to understand where the materials come from. We're so happy to get a pizza on Deliveroo, but no one has a single idea about where the ingredients of the pizza come from. And it's the very same with green technologies. We're so happy to drive green and to have our heat coming from clean technologies, but where do the metals come from? And we have lost this knowledge. It's why it's so hard to know, to catch up our delays on these new subjects that are coming to the tables. The green world is necessary. I just want to insist upon that. It's necessary to achieve the energy transition, but I'm afraid that this energy transition might come up with new challenges, and that the challenges of the oil world that we are trying to solve might just be replaced by the new challenges of the green world. Ecological challenges, economic challenges, geopolitical challenges. We just want to make sure, and maybe circular economy is a solution to that, that the green world is not just a repetition of the challenges we've been facing for the last century. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Guillaume, for this tour d'horizon on your findings, your book, and the situation on rare earth metals, which of course is quite dire. I would like just to pass the baton right away to Simon, who has a presentation himself. As Guillaume, if you managed to take down yours, as we did before, yes, and Simon can start with his, and he has been chairing an assessment, leading an assessment of really where do we stand on these metals, how much do we need, and how much is out there. So Simon, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hey, can you hear me and can you see the presentation? Right. Okay, I'm going to present two pieces of work which discuss the same issue that you just seen, but I put some numbers to it. This is the assessment of the extra capacity required of alternative energy electrical power systems to completely replace fossil fuels. Before we get to the actual piece of work, I'm going to show why this work was necessary when it was by us at GTK. Now, you're looking at metal price as tracked by the World Bank. All the base metals, the precious metals, oil, gas, and coal. So this is how the World Bank tracks the health of the industrial ecosystem. I've taken this data back to 1960 in a month-by-month resolution, and I've indexed the month of December 2001 to 100. What this does is get curves to overlay, and we can see periods of relative stability. So prior to 2005, things were relatively stable with the exception of the 1979 oil embargo. But after January 2005, we had a blowout in metal price. Now, this is the heartbeat of the industrial ecosystem. Metal price is the transfer point between those who extract metals and those who buy metals and turn them into useful things that we want. So something blew out that put the system in incredible stress. I make the case that this actually started in a chain reaction that started in the oil industry down to the month. And that later created the strain, which later, I believe, created the GFC. Now, that was the largest economic correction since 1929. That was not enough to correct whatever this was. So it's not speculation, it's structural, and it's still there. The purpose of this slide is to show that these questions are not something that might happen in an abstract form 50 years from now, but actually started 17 years in our past. We're in the change right now. And that comes to the piece of work, the first piece of work. This is the report. It's public domain. Its contents are for anyone who wants them. What I did here was I mapped the physical tasks done industrially by fossil fuels. And given that each energy system has an efficiency ratio, what was the useful scope, the useful work actually done by these systems? And if they were done by something else, how much extra power would we need? So I assembled all the non-fossil fuel systems that were available on the market at the time. I calculated the needed quantity of electrical power if everything was replaced and everything was non-fossil fuel. And when I did this, there was no understanding what the energy mix was. So I took the 2018 energy mix of non-fossil fuels and expanded it to the capacity required. And that gave us the number of power stations needed. This was the first generation of work. There's a second generation, which I'm about to show. In this report, we have number of vehicles by class, number and size of batteries, an understanding of when you'd use an electric vehicle and when you'd use a hydrogen fuel cell, estimates for both rail and maritime shipping for both electrical systems and hydrogen systems, phasing out fossil fuel power generation and other industrial applications. I examined the possibility of expanding the nuclear power plant fleet so it could become the primary energy source. I assessed biofuels and plastics and fertilizers. All that is in one report. So the approach was this. Over the next few years, we will implement non-fossil fuel systems as fast as the market will allow. And it's really difficult to predict how effective that's going to be. However, there will come a point when this existing system is fully replaced. All the cars and trucks that you see when you walk to work each morning, all the power stations, everything, it will now be non-fossil fuel, right? So I took, and then after that, presumably we'll see like a return of a more stable growth pattern, or so we would like to think. My work is to map that point there. So using the year 2018, where we've got a lot of data for now, what were the physical actions and what did they do? And if we were to replace them, what would be required? So what was the true scope? I looked at the size of the current transport fleet, cars, trucks, rail, shipping, aviation. I did it for the United States, European Union for 2018, China, I mapped China, and the world at large. And that gave us the number and size of required units. Now, in 2018, 84.5% of the global primary energy consumption was still fossil fuel based. Less than 0.5% in that year of the passenger cars were EVs. So what that meant was most of the non-fossil fuel system had yet to be constructed. And as it's not been constructed yet, it can't be recycled. So the first generation at least must come from mining. And so there was an examination of the power grid expansion, a number of new power stations, and there was an estimate of the required power storage buffer to manage intermittent supply. That turns out to be an interesting one, because that hasn't really been discussed properly in the literature. If you couldn't be bothered reading the report, just look at this little black square here. Current plans are not large enough in scope, and the task before us is much larger than the current paradigm allows for. The baseline calculation with something like this, I estimated 1.4 billion vehicles. That's conservative. The real number in 2018 was probably over 1.5. Now, of course, it'll be more. All of these values I'm presenting at the moment is for the year 2018. I'm not taking into account any kind of growth for the future. So those vehicles, 1.4 billion vehicles, traveled a little under 16 trillion kilometers. Now, because I did the whole system in electric vehicles as well as hydrogen, I was able to do some interesting comparisons. The electric vehicle system required a battery mass 3.2 times the mass of the equivalent hydrogen fuel tank. So a hydrogen fuel system for the same power storage would last 3.2 times longer, or could go 3.2 times further. But hydrogen is not an energy source, you've got to create it. So using electrolysis, we needed 2.5 times the electricity to make the hydrogen compared to charging the equivalent electric vehicle battery. Put those two together, all short-range transport should be electric vehicles, or anything that stays in a city or has a range of 100 kilometers or less. That's a guess. The real number could be slightly different. All passenger cars, commercial vans, trucks, what have you. 1.39 billion vehicles traveling 14.25 trillion kilometers across 1 year. To do this, we need 65.19 terawatt hours of batteries. Now things get interesting. All other assessments of the amount of batteries we need are in the gigawatt scale. I'm estimating terawatts because I'm replacing the whole system, whereas other studies are looking at a proportional market share sometime in the future. All long-range transport should be hydrogen fuel cells. All heavy trucks, all freight rail going between cities, the entire maritime shipping fleet. Now, all of these units can be electric. They work quite well, but when it comes to logistics and efficiency, it makes more sense if they're hydrogen. And the hydrogen economy will now be 200 million tons annually. So here is the fleet. Here's the electric vehicle fleet. That's the amount of power we will need to charge those batteries. This is the amount of power we need to phase out gas and coal power generation. This does not include the fossil fuels consumed directly by industry for heat. To manufacture a solar panel, those solar wafers need to be heated in a furnace to 2,200 degrees Celsius. They use coking coal to do that. If we take coking coal offline, what are our options to maintain that manufacturing capacity? That represents about a big proportion of coal and a big proportion of gas. They are not part of these calculations, so these numbers are, as big as they are still actually too small. This is the hydrogen economy, and that's the amount of power we will require to produce that hydrogen. Biomass was looked at. Now, biofuels could be the most sensible way to keep the aviation industry going. It could be the only way to keep the plastics industry going, with bioplastics. And our fertilizer for our food will probably have to be sourced from the environment as petrochemical industrial agriculture is restructured, because that we're already extracting too much out of the environment. So a genuine sustainability audit for the planet is required that has economic sustainability and biodiversity sustainability and a bridge between the two. At the moment, that doesn't exist. So let's put all these power requirements together. This is a very crude calculation, but even at that crude level, we will need 36,000 terawatt hours annually. But to do that, according to the energy split that I'm about to discuss, based on an ARENA 2022 prediction, we need 586,000 new non-fossil fuel power stations. And to put this in context, the existing fleet is only 46,000. We will need more than 10 times the number of the existing fleet to do this. This is reflecting on the difference in energy return and energy invested of the non-fossil fuel systems compared to the fossil fuel systems. And that's what the energy split looks like. Solar and wind are highly intermittent, and they need a power buffer. Without that power buffer, they're not viable. At the moment, the gas industry is that power buffer. Remove the gas industry, and the variations of that can no longer be absorbed. In 2022, ARENA released this nice report, and in it they predicted in 2050 what the energy split might be. And so most of the power will come from wind and solar, or that's their prediction. They still have a bit of fossil fuels. I took that and I added some of my own things, and I phased out fossil fuels completely. So I took the 2018 capacity, but I used the split for 2050 in the future. So if we were to deliver 1,000 terawatts of power to the grid over 1 year, how could we do it? In 2018, I ran some statistics of what the energy systems actually delivered. And I was able to run some statistics on what the average plant did and what the metrics around them, for example, operating hours. So this is what they produced annually. And you can see nuclear is our best performer, but it's the end of a very complex value chain. Coal and gas. But the future is believed to be solar PV and wind turbine arrays. And there's some of the smallest units. So to deliver 1,000 terawatts a year, we can do 142 coal-fired power plants, or we can do 30,000 solar PV array stations of average size, which I believe is about 37 megawatts installed power. So this is actually highlighting that renewables have a much lower energy return on energy invested ratio than fossil fuels, and they may not be strong enough to power the next industrial era. So this could well be that renewable power is actually a stepping stone to something else, but we don't know what that something else is. So like Guillaume mentioned, this is our plan. We will do it. There is no alternative, and it is required to happen. My numbers are showing that that plan may not be as useful as we hoped. So here is the second generation of work, where I actually use a different energy split. On the left-hand side is the energy that was produced in 2018. It was 26,614 terawatts. This is what we can keep. This is what we have to phase out, oil, gas, and coal. On the right, this is what we need to construct. So we are now looking at bringing in a replacement power grid that's substantially larger than the one is now, using very expensive and not so effective energy to do it. The tasks are charge the batteries, make the hydrogen, replace gas and coal power generation, heat the buildings, and there's the replacing coal-fired steel manufacturer along the top. So that's our task. So I actually took the ARENA 2022 split, and I had some of my own insights. Geothermal was expanded more than that. Hydroelectric was expanded more than what was recommended. And the rest was as split. So this is how I came up with this energy split. And then using the statistics I'd run on the average station, this is how many new average stations we would need. So now let's talk about buffer. Supply and demand must balance, and it must balance on a resolution of a microsecond, every thousandth of a second. Supply must equal demand. So here's a snapshot of Ontario in Canada. Supply and demand goes up and down all the time, especially in a day and night cycle. Now, nuclear, because of the nature of what it is, it cannot move around very much. Neither can coal, right? So for supply and demand to go up and down, we need something flexible. Hydro can be flexible to a point, but only within a relatively narrow bandwidth. And it's also got a lag time in that response. At the moment, this buffer is gas. Gas can be turned on and off at will. Look how variable wind was, and solar. The maximum wind generation occurred in a demand valley. Solar radiation varies not only with the weather, as in when it gets overcast, but also as a seasonal thing. There's less solar radiation in winter than there is summer. That's just a fact of life, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. Wind, in 2014, the United Kingdom Parliament did an assessment on wind. They found power production was so erratic it couldn't be predicted. As a reliable capacity, as a percentage of the maximum capacity, they found it was about 7 to 25%. Again, variable. So the variations in power can last weeks and in some cases months. But in practical terms, across 2018, in what was actually happening, solar PV was producing power 11.4% of the time. Wind was producing power 24.9% of the time. So when wind and solar get to a very large component, we need a massive buffer. At the moment, that buffer is external power grids that are usually fossil fuel. So supply and demand must balance. On the demand side, our transport sector could probably operate on a 48-hour buffer, and that will be enough to outmaneuver the weather. But the supply side, based on the literature, that can go for months. I'm taking a very conservative look. Watch this presentation by Jan Blomgren in Sweden, who talks about the mechanics of the actual power grid and power sharing. So this is the second generation work I've done, where I've got the second generation split. We're now going to have a buffer for wind and solar, solar PV. I didn't even include wind, solar thermal. In the literature, there were two references of use. One was 48 hours in 2012. Now that's just for basically electric vehicles. It's not for everything. That's way too small, but I'm going to use it anyway. Dost Frank in 2015 recommended 1 month buffer of the whole system, and it's generally to get through winter. So for a period of time, power will be withdrawn off that buffer over a period of time, and that buffer might last, say, 2 or 3 months. I'm using just 4 weeks for wind and solar only, not the whole system. So I'm looking at a conservative, quite a conservative small buffer, which if wind and solar represents 72.8% of the mix, is 2,017 terawatt hours of capacity. This is 30 times the size of what's required for electric vehicles. And it's conservative. Right, so now we've got the number of technology units, and the number of electric vehicles, batteries and hydrogen fuel cells, wind turbines, solar panels, and storage batteries. There was this report that actually was released that actually was starting to talk about what was the actual metal content of each of the battery chemistries. We're also able to have, so what would the market be in the future? They were actually able to predict, or they made a prediction of what the market could be in 2040, like which battery chemistries might dominate the market. And so I was able to take that information and use them as, well, this is the market split. We've also got the metal content for each of the chemistries. I was able to do the same thing for power storage. And that led to, once you summed everything up, there's about 30 tables here. I'm only showing you 2 or 3. I'm trying to get this published. Or I'll just do another report. So I now have the chemistry by metal for what we would need for the future based on a future prediction. And that comes down to this table when we sum it all up together by metals. This column here is the amount of metal we would need. Now remember, this is for 1 generation of technology, 1 round of electric vehicles and their batteries. Between 8 and 25 years later, they all wear out and they all have to be replaced, and we go again. This middle column is what the mining industry globally produced in 2019. I've used 2019 because it's the last year before the COVID pandemic, and it could be the last sensible year of data we'll see for some time. The final column is the number of years of production at our current rates that we will need to hit these targets. So what we're saying is current mining production is nowhere near close to producing enough metal to produce 1 generation. So the simple answer is open more mines. So, okay, so the same numbers are now compared against global reserves as stated by the USGS in 2022. And again, they're nowhere near enough. This column is the percentage of the reserves in the ground as stated at the moment as a percentage of what we need. Lithium, cobalt, and graphite and vanadium, all the battery chemistries are less than 5%. That is, current global reserves of these minerals and metals are less than 5% of what's required to produce 1 generation to replace the system we already have in 2018, not taking into account growth between 2018 and 2050. Now, if we can open more mines, for every 1,000 deposits discovered, only 1 or 2 become mines. The time to develop a deposit after it's been discovered is between 15 and 20 years. For every 10 producing mines, 2 or 3 will shut down because of market conditions. Assuming that we can just expand mining so easily is wishful thinking. So here's our last slide of data. So this is the data presented graphically. The red is the total metal required for 1 generation, but we're having 4 weeks buffer. But let's say 4 weeks is too much and we want to go 48 hours only. That's the blue. Note, this is a log scale. So global reserves are yellow and production is black. So reserves are not enough, production's not enough. Now, in 2020, less than 1% of passenger vehicles were electric vehicle. That didn't, and trucks weren't included at all. Trains or maritime shipping were not included. In 2018, about 4% of global energy was renewable. So what is not yet constructed cannot yet be recycled. And if it was all constructed next year, that's 2023, then large volumes would be available for recycling maybe in 2033, right? So recycling will be important. The question is how effective can it be based on current technology? That'll be the next piece of work. But the first generation, at least, must come from mining. And then that will fall back on all the issues that the previous presentation brought up. So current thinking has seriously underestimated the scale of the task ahead. Nuclear is vital, but cannot be scaled up as the magic bullet. Biofuels is vital, but we've got scale-up issues. Battery chemistries other than lithium-ion should and will be developed, each with their own resources. You can make batteries out of sodium, out of zinc, out of fluoride. Current mining production and current mineral resources simply aren't appropriate, as in they're not enough. It's at this point we're going to have to sort of relook at the whole approach and the whole plan. We don't really have an alternative, so we're going to do it. It's just that we've got to scale back our expectations of how this is going to go. Metals of all kinds are about to become much more valuable. This will change mining, but also will change recycling and waste management of all kinds. An evolution of the system is highly likely. I believe there's a coming renaissance for the exploration of mining and minerals. I also believe Europe will be opened as a mining frontier, whether that's politically correct to suggest that or not. And that's my presentation. Thank you. I'm sure there are questions. What do we got?
Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much. I think people are still having your presentation and Guillaume's sink in, but maybe I can, in the minutes we have, I can just get started. So I think these presentations are both quite dismal. What I get out of them is that, it's all very well and needed to go green, but the metals that are required at the technological frontier that we possess now, both in production terms and in reserve terms, are not nearly sufficient to deliver that transition. And also, we learned from Guillaume that they're highly concentrated in some geographical areas of the world. And the countries that currently possess them are not really intention to share them because they themselves are trying to attend their own domestic demand for these metals. So we're expecting, huge increases in the price of these metals, perhaps, and certainly a lot of challenges in getting hold of them. Is this, you mentioned, Guillaume, the review of critical metals by several, leading large countries or regions around the world. And are those going, you think, to inform a revision of the greening targets, or they're just, something that is done in terms of either, the ambition of the targets or the timeline for the targets? Because really, from the point of view of the Paris Agreement, the 1.5 Celsius and the consequences of the planet if we don't comply it's like a hard, it's a hard target. We're not going to be able to change that because that's, Earth science is not changing for our pleasing. So what's your take on that? What's going to happen to the climate agenda, given what we talked about today?
It's a large question. First, I'd like to say that the deposits of all these resources are not necessarily concentrated in specific countries. You find rare earths everywhere on Earth and even under the oceans. Recently, Japan, 4 years ago, said it had discovered, wells of rare earths in polymetallic nodules in the Pacific, in a priority exploitation zone, exclusive exploitation zone in the Pacific. But the reason why there is such a concentration is because we've decided to let countries getting specialized. But there's a way, obviously, to diversify the supplies and to have China holding less than 60% of the world production of rare earth in the future. And that brings me back to the question that you're asking. It's not only about resource, it's about reserves, as Simon Michaux has said. It's about the business model. And it's also about, there are other bottlenecks here. What about the electricity? You need to have electricity, you know, at an affordable price in order to make your business competitive. We've seen in the past China closing magnesium plants because they wanted to keep electricity for other purposes, including housing, heating. We are today in Europe in a situation where there is such a strong decrease in the production of aluminium. I think 50% decrease because of the price of electricity, which has skyrocketed. So this means that it's not only a question of availability of resource, it's the availability of the electricity to refine the resource. What about water? Water is being needed for refining copper and extracting and refining copper. Copper is being extracted in one of the driest areas in the world, south of the Atacama Chile desert. The Chuquicamata mine, which is the biggest open mine in the world, open pit mine in the world, consumes 2,000 liters of water per second in order to operate. What if there is a lack of water in order to process this? And then the social license to operate. It's okay potentially to extract an ore, a metal, but if the surrounding communities don't agree with that, we've seen recently in Europe, Rio Tinto, are obviously not extracting lithium in Serbia because local communities were against the extraction of lithium. So it's not a question of, potential theoretical availability of the resource. It's how do you get the local communities and politicians in the loop here? And it is our bottlenecks which might actually make the energy transition much longer than expected, not because there is no political will, but because there is no possibility to get the metals. And just to finish my answer, the International Energy Agency published a very interesting report in 2021, publishing and confirming these figures that I've shown you on the screen. And Fatih Birol, its general secretary, added by confirming these reports, the finding of these reports, that actually there is a discrepancy, there is a gap between our willingness to accelerate the energy transition and the availability of the resources to make this energy transition happen. So, it's really possible, and this just confirms what Simon Michaux has said, that actually we might not be able to do as fast as we want. Plus, if China holds a resource and if we are not able to diversify, the energy transition might be a Chinese transition before any other kind of transition.
Thank you. Thank you, Guillaume. We have a couple of questions, and Simon was stepping away and putting some links to reports in the chat. So Sarah Morris Lang had a question. Do you want me to read it out, Sarah, or do you want to ask it yourself? I can read. You there?
Yes, hi, thanks.
Hi. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I think, all of this information really points to the need for degrowth and rethinking, obviously, fundamentally how our economies work and how we're going to meet basic human needs. And so I was just asking, how do we begin these conversations? It's nobody's talking about this really. I mean, we're beginning to hear about it more, but it's very challenging. So I was just asking for some insights there.
Okay, I'll take that one. When I first came to Europe in 2015, I used to sit in these meetings in Brussels for H2020 and listen to the circular economy, and there was amazing blind spots, and there was lots of them. And it really sort of blew me away. And what seems to be happening is the basics has not been done. The very basic numbers have not been assembled in what is needed. All the strategies and policies being developed so far have been done without any sort of logistics or practicalities involved. This is not a market problem. This is a physical raw materials supply. And the paradigm around the critical raw materials list that they were talking about was how do they keep businesses alive, not the raw materials themselves. And so there's a series of misunderstandings at the very senior level. So we've got to have the discussion to understand what's happening. Then we can actually understand the shift in paradigm based on the boundary conditions we see. And once we understand those boundary conditions, for the first time, we can develop a plan. So that's the process we've got to collectively go through, right? And so that's how we've got to proceed. First understand, develop a new paradigm, then the plan. And at the moment, all existing plans are impractical for that reason. And the answers will be challenging. We may not like them, but we must face reality.
Yeah, I really side with what you just said, Simon. I think if these goals that countries have set are real, you would have a plan first and see if you have, the eggs in the fridge to bake the cake before you go right? That happens to me all the time, so I'm very familiar with that. But if you don't have those eggs, then you're talking either you're blind or maybe you just are announcing targets that you think you won't be accountable for. I mean, it could be that it's just throwing ball in the air of targets that are not necessarily owned by through that announcement. But if we were in a world where I think we were honestly generally concerned about these issues, and maybe we are, we should really start with a plan, and then looking at those boundaries. Certainly, like Sarah said, one of the things that could cave in for us is the insistence of growth. We had several seminars here at the IEO thinking about the role of growth and in the business model, in the economic model we have, and the tensions it poses for not just planetary prosperity but also social prosperity. That was a very good question. I have a question from Omar Bayer, which is actually Omar, are you here? Do you want to ask a question? It's asking about the ballpark estimates on the extent to which, here you are. Want to ask your question?
Thank you, Nicoletta. Thank you to the speakers as well. I think this was a really great session and really thought-provoking presentations. So as I wrote to the chat box, my key takeaway is that the issue is not only about timing. So there will be some scaling up for the supply side, but definitely it's also about the magnitudes. So there appears to be a huge role for demand destruction. And our ballpark as the fund, as you know, is $75 a ton of a carbon tax would do a lot of job in attaining some of these Paris objectives. So given these new calculations that you made, do you think we might need a much higher level of carbon or price-based incentives to basically scale back energy consumption? It goes back also to this degrowthing discussion as well, but what's your ballpark there?
So degrowth is probably a reality, but I would like to throw in a word of caution here. My father was born in Sri Lanka, so I'm actually sort of hearing what's happening on the ground in Sri Lanka, and they made decisions at a very high level without really consulting anyone else, and that would affect the lives of many people, and then just dropped the hammer. They decided to take the whole island into organic, and they shut down all petrochemical fertilizer operations. They did not include the farmers themselves to make them part of the solution. So everything crashed, everything was destroyed, and then they had riots and the government fell. We're now seeing a similar pattern unfolding in Denmark. The farmers were basically told, we don't need you anymore, we want you to go away. Their own livelihood and stuff. So, but they make the food for everyone. And so they were not brought in on the solution. They were not discussed about why you might do this and how might you transition from one system to another where they're not required to be destroyed. And they weren't included. So when you, and now we've got the situation we've got. So when we actually start throwing around things like we must have a massive carbon tax or a price tax, and then just let the economics sort itself out, what tends to happen is people lose everything. And instead of saying, well, that's just free markets for you, well, they're right. They will turn nasty, and they will turn nasty en masse, right? So when we're talking about a higher carbon tax, sure, you can do that, but before you do that, make sure all stakeholders are actually educated to the point where we understand what is needed and we all agree. Because if we don't agree, it'll be give war a chance. We have to evolve as a species very quickly on understanding this problem. And we also have to get there together. And if we can do that, then the person next to you is actually your solution, not your problem. It's not as simple as just applying a larger tax and just hoping it'll work. If you do that, move to Mars. It'll be simpler.
Well, some people think we should move. Thank you. I won't mention. There's a question, I think, for Guillaume here from Torsten Ehlers. Torsten, would you like to put your questions to Guillaume in the chat?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the great presentations. It was really worth the time. That's very insightful stuff. So I guess, you know, we should really take the high demand or the increasing demand for metals and minerals as given. I mean, at the end of the day, it makes sense, right? We're trying to move away from fairly fossil fuel intensive economy to something else. And that something else needs, you know, it's going to be driven by metals and other resources. So but my question is this: so you mentioned the sustainable production and, you know, the issues around basically destroying nature and perhaps other forms of pollutions that you could think of in the process of producing these metals. So what's the solution to this? I mean, is most of the pollution produced during the refining process, or is it kind of also due to the extraction itself? You know, if it was only due to refining, I guess, you know, we could do the refining somewhere else, let's say wherever the metals are actually needed at the end of the day. Or do we also have to worry about the extraction itself at the end of the day? Or does it vary across different metals and minerals? Thanks.
Oh, I just want to answer by giving you the example of Lynas. I've talked about Lynas, which is a rare earth company based in Australia, in Mount Veld. And in 2000, I think in 10, Lynas reopened its rare earth plant. And the extraction process is obviously per se polluting because nothing is green. But the refining process was even more polluting, to such an extent that Lynas decided to build a refining plant outside of Australia and to outsource the refining part to Malaysia in the Kuantan province. And that created lots of social tensions in Malaysia over there, because the populations were against this idea of having a Western company outsourcing the most polluting parts of the rare earth production process to a third world country. Eventually, this production plant is going on, processing plant, and Lynas has also a processing plant in Australia. But my understanding is that processing is more polluting than exploitation. Nothing is green. Green mineral, green mineral, green mining, all these words are just greenwashing. And that doesn't mean that we cannot do responsibly. We cannot do it in a responsible way. And I believe in the word responsible mining, which doesn't mean clean, but that means that some regulations are applying and some controls is being put in force. And we could do that in Europe. And we could obviously relocate what we've lost, what we've left gone outside back to our territories, including the United States. And actually, my argument is that it would bring more benefits than just bringing back some business and tax revenues. It would make the mining world cleaner. And that would be a good ecological decision to relocate our mining industries in the West. When I say that to ecological parties in France, I make lots of enemies. But I really believe so. And we have to at some point, because that's also the best way to make the supply chain more transparent. And if we don't, well, we have to develop new labels, which is being done right now. We have to, and this is being done in Europe and in the United States, develop ethical supply chain regulations in order to force companies to investigate their supply chains, to know where the materials come from, in which social and environmental conditions the metals has been extracted, so that you know, the energy transition becomes socially acceptable, both for those who are close to the mine and also for the end consumer who is more and more aware of that. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Guillaume. Thank you, Torsten. We have a comment by Stephen Miller in the chat that says that between the IPCC reports that say we can't heat the planet more and destroy biodiversity more, and this research that says that, you know, to shift technologies also is going to imply some really tough, you know, questions about planetary resources and socioeconomic challenges, we have to find a way to use less energy and to meet people's needs. I must add that, adding to this story of, you know, the social license, I lived for 2 years in Peru as a representative of the IMF, and I made sure I visited some of the core areas of mining, because that's one of the main, you know, inputs to GDP in Peru. So I went all the way to Yanacocha, over 4,000 meters from sea level, which is the second largest gold mine in the world. And you talk to people, you know, communities, as well as, of course, the, you know, the miner, the mining company, and you really feel, you know, the tension. You know, the cyanide, for example, used in gold mining, which is, of course, you know, a very terrible poison that, you know, impregnates the waters and kills, you know, fishes, flocks, and we, you know, these things are really serious trade-offs, and done on the scale that Simon showed us, you know, what is going to happen. We really need to think about these things hard. Now we're going to put online, and we're closing now on time at 1:15. I would like to thank you immensely, Guillaume and Simon, for presentations, which of course are eye-openers for all of us. But, you know, this is just the beginning for those that have, you know, heard these things a little bit more in detail today, because of course, both Guillaume and Simon have written extensively about these topics. We're going to post this presentation. And in that presentation, you're going to find the references to the Rare Matter book. You're going to find the references to the reports that Simon has prepared, which are, and all this material. I mean, I looked at myself, I read the book during the summer. I mean, this is incredibly important for us as economists that are going to be the vehicles and the advisor to policy in this green transition. So thank you again to everybody, but of course, most of all to Guillaume and Simon for their presentations. And maybe you can reach out to them if you have specific question on specific countries, because we cover almost the entire world with our membership. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.